Today on Co-op for Two, my top 13 strategy tips for the 7th Citadel. Tip 13 is to study the negative consequences of cards, of battles, encounters, especially compound encounters, and identify which steps, which ones you can afford to fail, and which ones would be catastrophic to fail. Frequently, you'll need to be strategic about not committing all your resources to an initial fight so that couple steps later, you can ensure that you defeat that step of the compound action all at once. Sometimes you'll even deliberately fail a step in order to avoid spending resources and saving them for a subsequent step. Tip number 12 is closely related to that, which is that sometimes the important decision is not how to win an encounter, but when to avoid it and not engage with it at all. Tip 11 is that it's tempting to save powerful cards that you draw in your deck for an emergency, for some time when you really need to use them. The problem with that is that in the 7th Citadel, you're drawing cards fairly regularly, and if you don't spend cards that you've drawn in your hand or purse cards, frequently you'll find yourself discarding cards because you're taking too many. And so saving cards for some special real emergency is often counterproductive. Sometimes if it can save you from drawing a couple cards, better to use it, free up the space in your hand or in your purse for new cards. Tip 10, we're given a world map here in the 7th Citadel, but you shouldn't trust it to be accurate. This is sort of an older map of the world you're in, and things have changed when you start playing. Roads and rivers may not be where they used to be, so don't trust this to be your complete guide to navigation. Use it as sort of a hint of how things used to be. Tip number 9. There are a huge number of different actions that you will run into while you play the 7th Citadel. And having cards that are specific to certain actions, frequently these cards are quite powerful. The problem is having the right card when you encounter the right action. So keep your eye open for cards that are sort of generically available to modify any action, these pure brown ones. These are extremely powerful because of how flexible they are. Even if a card looks half as good as another, but can be used on any test, that's worth considering. A similar thing happens with symbols. There are these different symbols on cards, arcane, strength, this stealth cloak thing, and it's hard to predict what symbols you're going to draw and have available on any given action. Any card which generates wildcard symbols or can use wildcard symbols, like that one can use any symbol to trigger, and certain other cards generate wildcard symbols, that should be considered much more powerful a card than it might first appear, just because it's so flexible. And then as the last sort of piece of this same family of issues, there are certain cards, most of the cards in your hand, you won't have to declare you're using until after you reveal cards from your result step. That should be viewed as much more powerful and useful. For example, these are standard things. You use them after you reveal successes, versus a card like this, which at first glance seems incredibly powerful. It generates a success. However, this card needs to be declared before you draw cards for your result. It will frequently be the case that you end up using this card when you didn't need to, whereas the cards that are normally, that don't have to be declared until after you draw results, can sort of be in your back pocket for emergencies. They let you play a little more conservatively. You know, okay, if I think I should be able to get enough successes with 3 cards. If I don't, I can count on these to save me. So these cards seem very powerful, but frequently you'll be wasting those. Tip number 6 is that having some consistency in your deck is its own reward. If you look, you're able to adjust your deck. You're doing a little bit of deck building over the course of a campaign in the 7th Citadel. And there are all these different symbols you can get. Fists, these cloaks, flags, and you might be tempted to try to give yourself a little of everything. Because some cards need this symbol, some cards need this symbol. The problem with that is that when it comes to drawing cards, now you have very little ability to predict what symbols you're going to get because you've got a little of everything. And if you wanted to ensure that you got 2 cloaks, you might have to draw a giant chunk of cards to hope that you'd get those 2 symbols that you're looking for. And it may be better for you to focus and have a little bit more of a consistent, predictable deck, knowing that I'm going to specialize in skills that need this one symbol because that's the symbol that I have most of in my deck, and that allows you to be a little more efficient with your card draws and increases the predictability of your card draws so that you can make better plans and be less dependent on luck. Tip number 5. There are skills that are very specialized for a very particular use and a very particular occasion. This one here is sort of a Hail Mary run from one end of the map to another. And you might think, well, how often am I going to need that? But more importantly, what are the odds I'm going to have this in my hand when I need to use it? Your hand size is quite small in 7th Citadel. So at first blush, that's a reason to avoid these cards that are so specific in their use. There's one card that lets us get out of a fight in an emergency, a forced fight. It's a very rare use card. Okay. The only thing to keep in mind there is that a major strategy in 7th Citadel and games like this is finding cards that let you retrieve a card of your choice from the action deck or the discard deck. Once you realize that you are going to have cards that let you retrieve a specific card of your choice, then all of a sudden the rare use cards, this very specialized use cards, suddenly get a new breath of life because it means that you can prepare, you can actively find that card to use in that rare occasion when you need it. So that combination of some rare, powerful cards with the card that lets you retrieve it is an important combination. Tip number 4 is sort of a corollary to the previous one, which is if you've got a card that allows you to go retrieve a card from your discard, sometimes from your action deck, you might be tempted to always save it for an emergency when you need a specific card. So maybe you've got a card that would let you fight in a certain way, but you're not sure you're going to need that, so you decide, okay, I'm going to wait. I'll hold on to this card. When I get into this battle where I need my bow and arrow or whatever, I'll use this to get it. And I'll wait till the fight to use this card to retrieve it. The thing to remember in the 7th Citadel is there's a very common thing that happens during encounters, which is you get a mandatory action. And when you get a mandatory action, you're not allowed to do other things like this. This is another action which is required to fetch this card. So you do have to consider that rather than waiting until the last minute when you need a card, you should be considering, do I need to do this now during a lull because I'm about to go somewhere or turn over a card that may force me to have an encounter where I wish I had it. So you're going to have to balance those two things together. Tip number 3. While you're playing a scenario, you'll be told what your Groundshiver level is. The major effect of that comes when you start walking around the world and you encounter these exploration cards. All of the exploration cards have this dual cost. The first cost is the baseline cost. You can see exploring in the level 6 area of the world costs you 10 cards, which is an enormous amount of cards to play just to flip over and look at this card and explore into this area, except if your Groundshiver is level 7 or higher. So all the different areas have different required Groundshivers to be free. These hash signs are always free. Here's a level 1. As long as your Groundshiver is 3 or higher, you can do this free. Otherwise, you pay 4. And what you should keep in mind here is that these are sort of used as a heuristic to give you a hint about what areas you probably don't need to be in for the scenario you're playing. So every scenario you play tells you what your Groundshiver is, and that's a little bit of a hint as to where you should confine most of your travels during that scenario. So it's not going to be the case that you're playing some scenario and the game will require you to spend a large amount of time in a region that's got a cost of 10 to explore. It's just not going to happen. It's not feasible. So consider that a little sign. When you venture off course for what the scenario wants you to be spending your time doing, you'll start encountering these exploration cards that are too expensive for you. Tip number 2, when you play a scenario, when you read the threat book that tells you all of the threats, all of the scenarios will tell you what your goals are, your rough goals for the scenario are. And what I would suggest to you is that you focus on achieving the minimal goals before you start really venturing off and exploring. You're going to have limited time to play each scenario because your health will run out. And I think you're trying to balance always achieving the goals and doing a little bit of exploration and a little bit of doing the things you can see. And so my suggestion is try to have a little bit of blinders when accomplishing the minimal goals laid out for you. And then you're going to find that you have a little bit of time left or a lot of time left to do other stuff, to explore more, to take more chances, to test out what's over here, what's over there. Goals first. Don't worry about super achieving goals. Frequently you'll read in a scenario, you need at least this many objectives to move on. And I think once you get those minimal number, you can relax a little and shift into more of an exploration mode. And my number 1 tip, there are certain conditions in the 7th Citadel that you can get. You can get injured and poisoned and weakened, all these other things. And those carry over between scenarios, and then they can be very hard to get rid of. So my suggestion is when you start looking past an encounter or a choice that you're going to make, learn which card consequences reflect these long-term weaknesses and do whatever you have to do to avoid getting them. You also have some options in building upgrades to build buildings that let you get rid of them, but they're so costly with such long-term effects that are unpleasant and unfun that I do encourage you to always keep your eye open or be thinking about, well, if we jump down these cliff rocks, there's probably a pretty good chance that the consequence of failing that is going to be a long-term injury that's going to stay with us for a while. So try to think about those injuries and avoid them. They're much more unpleasant than losing some cards. I hope you found something in that list that's useful to you. You might also check out my videos on DIY upgrades for the 7th Citadel, commonly overlooked rules, tips for enjoying the game. And we've got a whole bunch of playthroughs of these scenarios that you might want to watch after you've played them yourself.